Thank you so much, everybody. Good afternoon. As mentioned, I do not speak on behalf of the task force. I'm a member of the task force. I'm going to talk about that in the second part of my comments. I want to do some framing, and I want to be very clear that this framing is me speaking and not the Federal Task Force on Drug Use. So the first thing that I wanted to frame is that, of course, we all remember last summer and the protests for George Floyd that spread across the world and including in Canada, and the many protests that came from that, not only to be in solidarity with George Floyd, but to recognize the impacts of racism and policing in our own country. And the reason why I raise that is because, of course, George Floyd was also a victim of the war on drugs. George Floyd, in the defense that Derek Chauvin made, that defense centered around George Floyd's alleged drug use and the idea that since he was high, potentially on fentanyl, that therefore he was essentially at fault for his own death and that he was guilty. And this was used in order for the defense to dehumanize George Floyd and also to justify his killing. So I want to raise that because we do not forget that in the many, many conversations that we had last summer and in the time since then, this has really been a conversation about the war on drugs. And we cannot separate George Floyd's death, nor our conversation about Black Lives Matter, nor our conversation about racism in Canada from that fundamental fact that George Floyd's death is a casualty of the war on drugs, which comes along with the arming of police, which comes along with the intensification of surveillance, and which comes along with, of course, and as was already mentioned, the racist structures of policing that underlie that moment. I also want to raise and tribute to Corey Cardinal, who recently passed due to an overdose, having been released from prison in April. And those who know Corey Cardinal's work know that Corey was a fundamental shaper of Indigenous abolition in Canada. He spoke out for prisoners. He was a warrior, an organizer, and as many people who have been released from prison without supports, without any of the resources, without treatment, and of course released during a pandemic. Corey Cardinal died last week of an overdose, of a toxic drug supply overdose, and that death was completely preventable, not only because of safe supply, but because of the resources that could have been given to people like Corey in order to prevent that death. So what I want to connect here is also the connection between incarceration, the war on drugs, and of course, settler colonialism and its impact on Indigenous people in Canada, who continue to make up the vast majority and ever-growing population of people in prison. 44% of federally incarcerated women are now Indigenous women. Indigenous men are highly incarcerated. Indigenous people, of course, face far more harsh incarceration, higher security ratings, etc. And that is also tied to the war on drugs. So in other words, the crisis with the war on drugs is also a prison crisis and is also a policing crisis, and it cannot be separated from our conversations about defunding policing and incarceration. So those are things I wanted to raise, and those are in my own words. As I said, that does not represent the comments of the task force. Something I also wanted to raise here as well is that I want to recall the impacts of our so-called decriminalization of cannabis as a warning. Before cannabis was decriminalized, we knew that the police were essentially had abandoned policing drugs when it came to white people. Yet some studies showed that then at that point, 50% of drug stops, and of course, Black people make up far less than 50% of the population, were devoted to stopping Black people. And of course, every study shows that drug use is common and even among races, yet Black people, Indigenous people remain singled out and criminalized. And the reason why I want to raise the specter of our cannabis legalization is that many, of course, including me, have argued that in many ways that maintains a criminalization structure that is more intense. We went from 3 charges to over 40 regulations on driving, dropping reasonable suspicion for driving, all these different ways in which those rules have continued to impact Black people and criminalize Black people, despite our claim to drugs being to cannabis being legalized. And I sound that as a warning bell because any conversation that we have about decriminalization in this country, we have to recognize that Black people continue to be the people that suffer the most and continue to be victimized even post these discussions. So while in a limited way, we welcome, for example, the dropping of possession charges for simple possession and dropping of minimum for that, Crown and police discretion is still maintained. And we know that when the Crown and police have discretion, they will always use that discretion in order to be racist to Black people. So any law that we make in this country must be subjected to what Ronaldo Walcott has called the Black test. And this is the notion that whatever we say and whatever we think and whatever we do, we always have to ask the question, how is this going to impact Black people? And as my sister says, who is a lawyer, even if we decided that the penalty for all crimes was writing an essay, we know that Black people would have the longest essays and they'd be marked the harshest. So I want us to keep that in mind as we move forward in a conversation about drug decriminalization, that there are many, many ways outside of simple criminal charges that people continue to be criminalized by the system, not least, of course, to raise how women are criminalized through so-called care systems, particularly through things like the social work system, where women continue to have their children taken away to them due to addiction issues, and the way that carers, including doctors and nurses, teachers, and other people within our so-called caring institutions, particularly when it comes to policing women, women's parenting, women's drug use, that many, many women find their families shattered because of the war on drugs, which may not always take place for those women in terms of criminalization and imprisonment, but certainly takes place through the other ways that women find their families and intimate spaces surveyed. For example, Dr. Idil Abdullahi recently did her dissertation on how Ontario works, acts as a gateway for criminalization of Black women. And that dissertation showed comprehensively how social workers, for example, tend to report women, judge Black women more harshly, et cetera. So those are just my sort of introductory frames. Oh, sorry. And the last thing I wanted to say here is also to recognize migrant workers and border policing. So when we think of decrim, and this is something that the task force, and I can say this on behalf of the task force, something the task force very much had to deal with was the very broad range that we have to address. It is not simply a matter of safe supply, although that is important. It is not simply a matter of treatment options, although that is important. We also have to understand, as we think about criminalization and policing in particular, how many different sites that takes place at. So for example, we cannot have a drug decriminalization policy that does not recognize that migrants, for example, face deportation. Border policing, of course, is extremely intense, partially due to the war on drugs, and that we cannot ignore, for example, the construction of the border and those who do not have status. Those are not separate from the war on drugs. So while we do not have data on this, those who work with migrants know that deportation, fears of getting of non-status, the inability to seek treatment if you don't have status in this country is all impacted by that. So in other words, in order to fully decrim, it is not just a matter of saying, okay, well, we'll just take these drugs and release possession charges. We have to think about more broadly, what is this racist settler colonial frame? What is the homophobic frame? What is the transphobic frame, the misogynist frame, all these things? How does that ideology go through our society that results in the punishment of drug users who also are more likely to be Indigenous, more likely to be Black, more likely to be living in poverty, more likely to be people with disabilities, sex workers, and people who continue to be policed on other fronts as well. So in other words, we cannot have decrim while ignoring the way that people are criminalized in other sites. We cannot have decrim while maintaining a criminalized and police border. We cannot have decrim while maintaining the policing of those who are seen outside of the notion of public. And we cannot have safety for anybody while we maintain the notion that punishment is okay for some people and not for others. And of course, that framing is my own and not the task force. I will now briefly say something about the work of the task force. As I said, we were working with on a very broad basis. We wanted to think about all the many, many ways that drug policies impact people. So that certainly encompassed thinking about Indigenous people. For example, also alcohol laws and tobacco laws that have continued to target Indigenous people. Very much thinking about racism. We wanted to also include a gender analysis of that, and I mentioned some of that analysis. And in particular, we were interested in also challenging the social ideologies around drug use. So again, and MP Don Davis actually did a really comprehensive job of speaking about this, that we can make all the law and policy in the world, but as long as we have hundreds of years of public attitudes about drug users, about drug use, we will continue for the public to want to punish drug users, and we will find other ways to punish people, right? Even if we remove laws to punish people one way, as long as we continue to discriminate and stigmatize people who use drugs, we will continue to harm people. So it's very important in the work of the task force as well to address those social ideologies, to think about stigma, to think about education, particularly, for example, and we were not afraid to go into areas such as thinking about youth and drug use, which is, of course, always politically inexpedient and, gets used. Oh, you want kids to take drugs if you make cannabis legal. So we had to encounter those very difficult issues. Obviously, the task force was drawn from a number of different places. I don't want to speak too much about the people. You can go on the website, but I think everybody agreed that boldness was needed at this moment, and that to be a task force that again, and we also had this in the previous presentation, that to advocate simply for incremental change or what would be popular or what would be politic would be to continue to lose lives in this crisis. So we advocated for a position of strong decriminalization, and people will, I think, see the feedback from that. So I don't want to say too much because I don't know where my lines are for overstepping. I'm saying this carefully because I'm a member and I'm not one of the chairs, and it is really important to respect that. But I think that I can say that much, that certainly those who were on the task force, which is a mixture of people with lived and living experience, those who work in different fields, those who work in other areas of criminalization, we're certainly trying to do something that we understood that our work was to save lives, and that every day that we delay, people are dying, and that we need at this point a real solution from our government. Nothing incremental, nothing just to be scared of what the public is going to say, but something broader than that. And I hope that that is enough to say about the task force. The final thing I wanted to say is, no, I think I said everything. I have my notes. I'm sorry, I have notes here, but I'm trying to be careful. So I think I'll end there, and there is room for questioning. And just to be clear again, my comments on policing, defunding, abolition, those are all attributed to me and not to the rest of the task force. But from myself, I would say that we cannot have decriminalization without also considering things like defunding and abolition as well. Thank you very much.
Elle, thank you so much for that. And thank you for underscoring that dealing with criminalization is just one part of a larger agenda of ending a punitive and harsh approach to dealing with drugs and members of our community who use drugs, and that we need to actually connect it to other struggles and need to be thinking boldly. So thank you very much, Elle.